Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into one of the most curious and I think potentially dangerous paradoxes of human cognition. And it's all about that feeling of confidence. Think about the last time you faced a test where the questions seemed, I don't know, almost insultingly easy, like an intro quiz or a basic checklist.
Right.
You probably felt compelled to go back and overcheck your answers. You're thinking, is this a trick question? Am I missing something really obvious here?
Yeah, you start to doubt yourself.
Exactly. You end up being super accurate. You get 95% right. But if someone asked you to rate your confidence, you might only say you felt, 80% confident.
And that gap, that's classic underconfidence.
Yeah.
And it's a huge warning sign.
So now, as you said, let's flip that around completely.
Okay.
Imagine approaching a truly monumental, incredibly complex challenge. This could be, anything. Structuring a huge multi-million-dollar business deal, or maybe designing a totally new AI system from scratch.
Or trying to predict something chaotic, like a low-probability global event, something with massive ambiguity.
In those domains, right, the really high difficulty ones, we see confidence just soar. People feel 80% certain, maybe even 90% certain.
And then the dust settles.
And they realize they were right maybe 50% of the time, or, even less. That's pervasive overconfidence.
And that collision, that's what we're here to talk about.
Exactly. That collision between the objective difficulty of a task and your subjective feeling of competence, where you express all this doubt on the easy stuff, and at the same time, you show this totally misplaced certainty on the hard stuff.
That is the hard-easy effect, or AE.
And it is absolutely central to understanding, metacognition, self-regulation, and frankly, some really catastrophic decision-making. But as we're going to see in our source material, it's a lot more complicated than just a simple bias.
Oh, absolutely. Our sources today reveal that the HE isn't just one simple cognitive quirk happening inside our heads. It's really more of an umbrella term for two, maybe even three, really distinct psychological and behavioral phenomena. And they operate across totally different scales, from like classical conditioning in animals all the way up to computational hardness in human decision-making under stress.
So our mission for this deep dive is to pull apart these different definitions, these different threads.
And then synthesize them. Turn them into an actionable model for you, the listener, so you can navigate complexity a little bit better.
We have a fascinating stack of sources to do it, too. We're pulling from everything. Academic papers on, get this, flavor aversion conditioning in rats.
A class.
All the way to these really intense philosophical and statistical debates over whether confidence bias is even real or if it's just, an artifact of bad test design.
And then we'll round it all out with some really cutting-edge neurological studies. They use gaze tracking and objective computational metrics to see what happens to our brains under acute stress.
This sounds like a truly multifaceted deep dive.
It is. We're going to start by looking at the HEE as a fundamental confidence trap, a failure of self-monitoring. Then we'll pivot to the complete opposite concept, something called the easy-to-hard effect, or ESHE.
Which is not a trap.
No, it's actually an optimized strategy for learning truly difficult skills. And finally, we'll look at how external contextual factors, things like acute physiological stress, and that constant trade-off between effort and just plain boredom, how they completely change our willingness and our capacity to engage with difficult tasks successfully.
Okay, so let's start with that classic psychological definition. This is the one that you'll see most often in judgment and decision-making research because this is really where the HEE was first flagged as a kind of bias.
Right.
The core definition is described as a non-monotonic relationship. That's between item difficulty, so your actual objective accuracy, and your confidence judgments about that accuracy.
And that phrase, non-monotonic, it sounds a bit academic, but it is the absolute key to understanding the HE as a cognitive trap.
Unpack that for us. What does it actually mean?
It just means the relationship between how well you do and how confident you feel isn't a straight line. It doesn't always go up together. You'd expect that as you get more answers right, your confidence goes up proportionally.
Like a one-to-one correlation.
Exactly. But with the hard-easy effect, that's not what happens. If we were to plot your actual accuracy against your confidence calibration, what we find is that at the extremes, the really easy stuff and the really hard stuff, that correlation just breaks down completely.
So how does it break down?
Well, specifically, when subjects are performing tasks where they have very high accuracy, the easy tasks, their confidence tends to be significantly lower than their actual performance.
That's the underconfidence we mentioned.
That's classic underconfidence.
Yeah.
And then conversely, when they're tackling tasks where their actual accuracy is low, the really hard tasks, their confidence it flies way above their true performance.
And that's the dangerous overconfidence.
That pervasive and often very expensive overconfidence.
So if you imagine a graph, the perfect relationship would be a straight 45-degree line, right? 90% accuracy equals 90% confidence.
Perfect calibration.
The HEE is where we dip below that line on the easy side, and then we just spike way, way above that line on the hard side.
Yep, that's the curve.
It almost sounds like our internal self-monitoring system it's broken. And it's broken precisely when we need it most. Either when things are going smoothly, which causes us unnecessary doubt, or when we're really struggling, which gives us this reckless certainty.
That is an excellent way to put it. And the implications of that for, say, self-regulated learning or really any high-stakes decision-making environment are enormous.
How so?
Well, think about it. If you can't accurately monitor your own level of knowledge or your competence, how are you supposed to know when to stop studying, or when to ask for help, or when to trust a complex model versus your own gut?
You're flying blind.
You're flying blind. The metacognitive failure here directly impairs how you strategically deploy your resources, whether that's time, money, or just cognitive effort.
And the data we have really supports the idea that this miscalibration is sticky. It persists. One detailed study we looked at was examining this at the item level in an educational setting.
Right, the review lesson study.
Yeah, and it confirmed this non-monotonic relationship vividly. They had participants complete a review lesson and then give a confident self-report after every single item they answered.
And this study provided a really critical and I think deeply counterintuitive finding about how we integrate new information. The researchers wanted to see if giving people objective data could correct the hard-easy effect.
So just tell them if they were right or wrong and see if that fixes their confidence meter.
Basically, yeah. They break participants into groups. Some received immediate item-by-item feedback. Green check for correct, the red X for incorrect.
Yeah, the other group.
The other group got no feedback at all. They were the control.
Okay, so what happened to what they call monitoring accuracy, the actual correlation between the confidence someone reported and their real performance? Did that immediate feedback help?
This is the wild part. It was the exact opposite, which was just a massive insight for anyone designing a learning system. They found that monitoring accuracy was, first of all, statistically poor across the board. The HEE is a really robust effect.
So it's hard to shake, no matter what.
Very. But crucially, and completely contrary to what you'd expect, monitoring accuracy was significantly less accurate when immediate feedback was provided, compared to the control group that got no feedback at all.
Hold on, let me just repeat that to make sure I'm hearing it right. Giving people objective, immediate data, the clearest possible signal of you were right or you were wrong, made them worse at aligning their confidence with reality.
That's what the data showed.
That sounds completely bizarre. On the surface, it makes no sense. Why would knowing the truth right then and there impair your self-judgment?
It suggests that our confidence judgments aren't simple, linear calculations based on immediate objective facts. They're driven by multiple and potentially competing internal cues. And this points to a deeper phenomenon that our sources call cognitive inertia.
Cognitive inertia. Okay.
It means that when your system is faced with conflicting information like, my internal feeling says I'm 80% confident, but this external data point says I was wrong, the system doesn't necessarily update. Instead, it seems to kind of retreat back to a stable internal set point.
Okay, let's unpack that inertia mechanism more. The sources bring up these two concepts: stability of individual response styles, or SIRS, and hysteresis. They sound like, I don't know, heavy-duty physics terms being applied to the brain.
They are, but they're incredibly helpful for describing this stability. SIR is actually pretty simple. It just means that your confidence judgments tend to cluster around your own personal self-referential set point.
My own personal default confidence level.
Exactly. So if you, the listener, generally think of yourself as a highly confident person, your responses will tend to hover around an 8 or a 9 out of 10. And that happens regardless of whether you just crushed an easy question or totally struggled with a hard one. The set point is sticky. It resists immediate change.
So my confidence is like an internal thermostat that's kind of stuck at 8 out of 10. And it takes a really serious, repeated effort to drag it down or force it up in any significant way.
That's a perfect analogy. And the term hysteresis describes the tendency for the current state of a system to depend on its recent history.
How does that apply here?
The study noted that, especially when objective performance feedback was absent, the confidence self-reports showed this significant inverse autocorrelation at lag 1.
In English.
It just means that a previous confidence response significantly influenced the next confidence response, but inversely.
Which means if I gave a high confidence score on, say, question 5, that score acts as a kind of psychological anchor.
Right.
And it drags my confidence for question 6 back up, even if I felt deeply uncertain about question 6.
That is the inertia at work. Your confidence is acting as a powerful mental shortcut, a heuristic, especially when more relevant, processing-intensive information isn't available, like when there's no feedback.
But this reliance on internal stability means the whole system is inherently slow to adjust to objective reality.
Very slow. In the case of the HEE, this inertia means the miscalibration just persists. It keeps dragging high confidence scores back up during the hard tasks, and it keeps low confidence scores anchored down during the easy tasks, even when feedback tries to intervene.
So what this suggests is that we probably need fundamentally different ways of training metacognitive awareness. Just giving people a score right away isn't enough. It might even be counterproductive.
It seems so. The problem is deeper than just a lack of information.
Okay, so that leads us to a really big debate in this field. For decades, the observation of that pervasive overconfidence on hard tasks, especially in things like general knowledge quizzes, which city has a larger population?
The classic Trivial Pursuit style questions.
Right. That was universally interpreted as a fundamental flaw in our cognitive processing. Researchers proposed all these internal mechanisms, like a confirmatory search of memory, where we only look for evidence that supports our first guess, which makes us feel more confident than we should.
And that was the accepted wisdom for a long time. Humans are just fundamentally prone to this kind of cognitive failure when things get complex.
It was, but it led to some really intense academic debate. Researchers like Jocelyn, Winman, and Olson, they launched a very strong critique of that whole idea.
They really did. They argued that this perceived cognitive overconfidence bias was often wildly inflated by basically methodological flaws. They argued that a lot of researchers were engaged in what they called naive empiricism in the face of just basic statistical reality.
Naive empiricism, that is a strong accusation. They're basically saying that decades of research might have been built on bad data, that we were using trick questions to prove people were fundamentally biased.
That's the core of it. What specific methodological flaws were they pointing to?
They identified two big ones: primary statistical and sampling issues that were artificially inflating the hard-easy effect.
Okay.
First, the widespread use of biased item selection. Traditional studies, especially the ones that generated the most spectacular, headline-grabbing overconfidence results, deliberately used what they called selected item samples.
So they weren't random questions.
Not at all. They were curated, cherry-picked items, often trick items or obscure but sort of fascinating facts, where the common probabilistic inferences that an average participant might make would lead them to the wrong answer.
Do you give an example?
Sure, like asking which of two geographically close, relatively small cities is bigger. A participant might feel, say, 75% confident based on their general knowledge structure, but because the test item was selected specifically to be misleading, their actual performance might only be 50-50, like a coin flip.
So the resulting 25% gap gets written up as a deep cognitive bias.
Exactly. Researchers were, in a sense, designing tests that were intended to trip people up, and then concluding that people are fundamentally biased when they fall for the trap.
Which sounds a bit like a rigged experiment, or at least one that doesn't really reflect how we use knowledge in the real world.
That's the heart of the critique. The alternative, they argued, is to use representative item samples. So here, questions are randomly selected from a clearly defined population of objects in the environment, say, all German cities with over 100,000 inhabitants.
A fair sample, not a tricky one.
A fair sample. And when they collected data using these representative samples, they found something critical.
Which was?
The extreme overconfidence bias largely disappeared.
Wow. That's a huge finding. So if the bias isn't primarily a cognitive flaw, what is it that creates the appearance of the hard-easy effect?
It really boils down to basic statistics and calibration. Jocelyn's team showed that the HE can arise as just a simple regression effect, an error in the judgment process that averages out over many samples, and it gets compounded by things like scale and effects and the linear dependency between accuracy and confidence.
So it's more of a mathematical artifact than a psychological one.
In many cases, yes. Here's the key synthesis point from their quantitative review. They found that the mean subjective probability, So the average confidence people expressed across all questions, hard and easy, was remarkably stable and precise. It often hovered around 73% for both the tricky selected samples and the fair representative ones.
People have that stable internal confidence rating, that SIRS set point we just talked about.
The 73% is their internal gauge. It's the output of their cognitive thermostat.
Okay, that makes sense.
So if the test was rigged with trick questions, the selected sample, the participant's actual proportion correct might drop to, say, 60%.
And suddenly you got a 13-point gap, which looks like massive overconfidence, especially on the harder items.
Right. But when the test was fair, the representative sample, their actual proportion correct, rose closer to 70–75%, and suddenly the bias just evaporated.
So the appearance of the bias was really being driven by the test makers, not necessarily by fundamentally flawed human cognition.
To a significant degree, yes. They argue that when you correct the data for these statistical artifacts, the hard-easy effect, as a sign of some deep, pervasive cognitive failure, is nearly eliminated in certain data sets.
So this doesn't mean confidence miscalibration isn't real.
No, not at all. The HE clearly exists as a reliable miscalibration of confidence relative to accuracy. But its source may be less about an internal cognitive failure and far more about external task construction and the inherent mathematical relationship between performance and the over-under confidence score you calculate.
So for you, the listener, when you're navigating complex information, the question you have to ask yourself is, are these problems I'm trying to solve representative of reality? Or have they been selected, maybe unintentionally, specifically because they're misleading?
That's the crucial question.
So that's thread one of our deep dives. A big psychological warning. The hard-easy effect is a confidence trap, and it's potentially made much worse by statistical artifacts. It fundamentally messes with how we judge ourselves.
Right. But now we need to completely shift our perspective because our source material suggests that difficulty isn't just a psychological failure point. It can actually be a deliberate, necessary strategy for mastery.
Absolutely. The other side of this coin, which is often studied completely separately in learning theory, is the easy-to-hard effect, or EHE. This is a historical and really robust finding, especially in discrimination learning research, and it has massive implications for how we structure any kind of skill acquisition or training program.
Okay, so this isn't about confidence anymore. This is purely about optimizing the sequence of training. What's the core principle?
The core principle is that pre-training a subject, and that could be a human, student, an animal, even a machine learning model, on an easier version of a complex discrimination task will significantly facilitate the acquisition of the subsequent harder version of that task.
So you start easy to get to hard.
And crucially, this sequenced approach is consistently more effective than just training the subjects directly on the hard task from the get-go. You have to walk before you can run. But more specifically, the type of walking you do fundamentally dictates your future success at running.
Where did this insight even come from? It sounds like it must be older than modern cognitive psychology.
It is. It goes way back, over a century, to early conditioning research. Most famously to Ivan Pavlov's work in the 1920s.
The Pavlov's dogs guy.
The very same. Pavlov spent a ton of time exploring conditioned reflexes in dogs, and he was trying to train them to discriminate between two very, very similar stimuli.
What was the specific task he tried first?
He tried to train the dogs extensively to differentiate between a light gray circle and a white circle. The stimuli were just too similar, too nuanced right from the start.
And what happened?
He reported that after exhaustive training, he failed to produce the slightest sign of differentiation. The task was simply too difficult for the dogs to grasp without a proper foundation. So all that intense effort on the hard task led to an absolute failure of learning.
That's the failure condition then, direct hard training. So what happened when he tried the easy to hard approach instead?
He changed the sequence completely. He first introduced a much easier, much more salient contrast. A dark, almost black circle, contrasted very clearly with the white circle.
The easy discrimination.
That was the easy discrimination. And after only about 20 conditioning trials on this easy, high-contrast task, the dogs had learned the basic rules of differentiation. They got it.
So then what?
Then Pavlov reintroduced the original difficult task, the light gray versus the white, and suddenly the differentiation between them was successful and complete. That initial easy training wasn't just helpful. It was necessary to even enable the later, more subtle learning to happen.
That's a powerful foundational story. But how robust is this finding? Does it translate across different species and different kinds of tasks?
It translates remarkably well, which really confirms that the EHE is a general learning principle. We can look at two specific areas that show this robustness really well. First, there are studies using flavor aversion conditioning in rats.
Okay, how does flavor aversion relate to a hard versus easy discrimination task?
So, flavor aversion learning involves teaching a rat to associate a specific flavor, the conditioned stimulus, or CS, with an illness, the unconditioned stimulus, or US.
Right, they learn not to eat the thing that makes them sick.
Exactly. To make the discrimination hard, researchers used very similar flavor compounds. For instance, they'd have to distinguish between a flavor labeled AX and another labeled BX, where X is a common, overshadowing element that makes them taste similar.
So how did they test the EHE?
They compared two groups. The easy train, or ET group, first learned to distinguish widely different flavors, like AX versus BX, a really obvious difference. The hard trained, or HT group, started directly on that difficult AX versus BX task. And the results were dramatic. The ET group showed dramatically superior discriminative performance in the difficult stage compared to the HT group, who just struggled immensely.
That's a strong confirmation. But here's the critical question. Was the benefit just because the rats were exposed to the stimuli more, maybe they just got more familiar with them, what they sometimes call perceptual learning?
And that is the key theoretical distinction that the research addresses. The answer is no. The superior performance relies specifically on differentially reinforced discrimination training.
What does that mean?
It means the learning process has to happen where one stimulus, the CS plus A, predicts an outcome, and the other, the CS, does not. There has to be a consequence tied to the choice. Studies that use just passive pre-exposure to the same stimuli without any differential reinforcement did not show the same strong EHE effect.
So it's not just about seeing or tasting the things, it's the active reinforced comparison, the learning of what matters about the stimuli during that easy phase that builds the necessary foundation.
It's not just recognizing that the stimuli exist, it's recognizing the relevant dimensions of those stimuli.
Which is why the EHE is so crucial for any complex skill acquisition.
Absolutely. And we see this demonstrated again in auditory identification experiments. They did them on both humans and rats, where the task was to discriminate between very similar sound sweep rates.
Another hard task.
A very hard task.
Yeah.
And the effect in the rat studies was so extreme it became a benchmark finding. The rats that were initially trained on dissimilar sounds, an easy task, learned the subsequent difficult identification task successfully.
And the other group?
The rats that were trained extensively only on the difficult task failed entirely. They could not achieve the necessary differentiation without that easy ramp-up. It confirms that in certain contexts, progressive training isn't just a time saver. It is a prerequisite for learning to occur at all.
That is a profound finding. The progressive training didn't just speed up the learning, it unlocked the very capacity for learning the hard task in that context.
Right.
So did this easy to hard sequence change the rate of learning for the difficult task once the subject transitioned over? Did they learn faster?
That's a great question. And interestingly, the research suggests it doesn't generally increase the rate at which the subject learns the more difficult discrimination itself.
So what does it do?
What it does, thanks to that groundwork laid in the easy stage, is it raises the initial performance levels at the point of transfer. It gives a learner a huge jump start. They already know how to pay attention and what to look for, so they start the hard task much further along the path to mastery than the group that was trained directly.
Okay, let's get into the how. Psychologically or neurologically, what is that easy stage actually doing that prepares the brain so well? Our sources point to 3 classical explanations for this, all rooted in associative learning theory.
Right, and they all offer slightly different ideas about what exactly gets transferred from the easy task to the hard one. The first is the gradient interaction model.
And this one is all about how learning traces generalize, right?
Exactly. It's about gradients of excitation and inhibition and how they spread across the stimulus dimensions.
Walk us through the mechanics of that.
Okay, think back to the Pavlovian example. Black versus white is easy, light gray versus white is hard. The disparate stimuli in the easy task, the black and the white, they produce very strong, widely spaced gradients. There's excitation for the reinforced black stimulus and inhibition for the unreinforced white stimulus. And this wide separation means the learning traces are robust and far-reaching.
So it creates a really clear signal in the brain.
A very clear signal. Then when the subject transitions to the hard task, the 2 very similar shades, these strong, generalized gradients from the easy task overlap more effectively across the spectrum of stimuli than if you had started training with those closely spaced, subtle stimuli directly.
It's like the easy contrast created a wide learning net that was able to catch the subtle distinctions later on.
That's a great way to think about it. This immediate generalization produces that initial high-performance level and transfers the discriminative control. The sharp contrast of the easy task provides the necessary initial amplification of the signal.
Okay, the second major model focuses more on attention, not generalization.
Precisely. That's the selective attention model. This proposes that the learning process in the easy task specifically strengthens your selective attention to the relevant stimulus dimensions. In any discrimination task, there are tons of dimensions: color, size, taste, texture. But only one or two of those might actually be predictive of the outcome.
So the easy task teaches you what to focus on.
It teaches you to focus strongly on the dimension that actually predicts the outcome. This is what's called the general attentiveness hypothesis. The learning of one discrimination alters the rate at which subsequent discriminations are learned by making the subject more generally attentive.
So the transfer isn't specific to, say, the two shades of gray. It's that the subject has learned the skill of focusing on the relevant dimension of any stimulus set. It increases their overall learning efficiency.
It's like it increases a multiplicative learning rate parameter in the brain. The easy task optimizes the cognitive mechanism you use for learning. It renders the subject fundamentally more ready to distinguish subsequent stimulus changes, no matter what the physical nature of that change is.
And the third mechanism tackles the problem of irrelevant information, which is something we all struggle with in any complex environment.
That's cue competition. This mechanism, often explained using models like the Rescorla-Wagner model, suggests that training on an easy discrimination results in better overshadowing of irrelevant stimuli compared to training on a hard discrimination.
So it helps you filter out the noise.
Perfectly put. When the task is easy, the relevant cues quickly gain strong associative value because the relationship is crystal clear. This strong value pushes all the irrelevant cues into the background, diminishing their potential to interfere with subsequent learning.
So if the hard task has a lot of irrelevant dimensions, that could confuse the learner.
Starting with the easy task, which highlights the relevant dimension so starkly, causes those irrelevant cues to be overshadowed and just ignored early on. This focusing mechanism ensures the learner concentrates only on what is truly important for solving the subsequent hard task.
It makes perfect sense. Whether it's generalization, improving focus, or filtering noise, all three of these models share that same foundational requirement. That initial phase of learning needs differential reinforcement on an easy, clear contrast to build the cognitive scaffolding you need before you can manage the subtle, hard distinctions.
Okay, so we've established that difficulty affects our confidence and that strategically applied easy tasks can dramatically improve learning. Now we need to shift to the modern intersection of complexity and performance. Specifically, how acute stress in the environment itself change our fundamental capacity to make complex decisions when the task is genuinely hard. This is a crucial shift because we're moving into the realm of computational hardness. And this gives us an objective, theoretically sound way to measure difficulty that's quantified mathematically. It's independent of any specific cognitive task or an individual's prior knowledge.
And that's important. Why?
It's critical because most of the prior studies on stress and decision-making either focused on very isolated cognitive functions, like working memory, or they used measures of complexity that were highly subjective. Just asking people, how hard was that?
So let's talk about the methodology the researchers used to connect stress to objective hardness. They used something called the 0-1 knapsack decision task, or KDT. For our listeners who aren't familiar with computational theory, what exactly is the KDT and what makes it computationally hard?
The 0-1 knapsack decision task is a classic optimization problem. It's a hallmark of what are called NP-hard complexity problems in computer science. Participants were shown a set of items, and each item had a specific value and a specific weight. They were also given a capacity constraint, a maximum total weight the knapsack can hold, and a target profit. The task is to decide yes or no as quickly and as accurately as possible. Does there exist a subset of these items whose combined weight is within the capacity constraint and D, whose combined value meets or exceeds that target profit?
It sounds deceptively simple when you lay it out like that.
It does, but to solve it optimally, you often have to consider an exponentially large number of combinations. And that just quickly exhausts human working memory capacity. It truly requires mental juggling and very careful optimization.
So participants are juggling items, values, weights, capacity constraints, target profit, all at the same time. But how did the researchers objectively measure the hardness of any single instance of that task? Because one version could be really simple with an obvious solution, and another could be fiendishly difficult.
They used a metric called instance complexity, or IC. IC quantifies the computational resources, in this case, the number of internal logical steps required for an effective algorithm to solve that specific instance of the KDT. This is the gold standard for defining objective difficulty. It's task-independent because it relies on formal logic, not human bias.
So it's a pure math definition of hard.
Exactly. And importantly, they designed the task so that lower IC values meant a mathematically harder problem, one requiring more computational steps. They sampled instances, so they had an average of 70% accuracy for the hard ones, the low IC trials, and 90% accuracy for the easy ones, the high IC trials. This proved the IC metric successfully predicted how human performance would vary.
That gives them a perfectly objective dial for difficulty. Now, how do they introduce the stress element into the experiment?
They used the widely validated Trier social stress test, or TSST. They had people do the knapsack task in a stressful session and compared their performance to a control session on a separate day.
And what does the TSST involve?
It involves preparing and delivering a spontaneous speech and then performing challenging serial arithmetic, all while being watched by observers in white coats. It reliably induces acute psychosocial stress.
And they measured this how?
They verified it using physiological measures, specifically by tracking cortisol levels, the stress hormone in saliva samples taken throughout the experiment.
Okay, so let's get to the findings. What happened to performance when high cortisol levels met high computational hardness? What was the core interaction?
The first finding was that overall higher cortisol levels were associated with lower decision quality with reduced accuracy. No huge surprise there, but the interaction was the real story. This impairment was specifically and overwhelmingly concentrated among the computationally harder trials.
The low IC trials.
Low IC trials. Stress magnified the performance loss only when the mental demand was at its highest.
So on the easy tasks, the students under stress were basically fine. But on the hard tasks, that's when the stress crippled their performance.
Precisely. But the most substantial, the most critical deficits in decision quality occurred not just under stress, but when that acute stress was accompanied by experienced time pressure. This is a crucial interaction that often gets overlooked in these kinds of studies.
How did they define experienced time pressure in their task?
It was defined operationally as the trials where participants used the maximum 40 seconds available to them. In other words, they timed out. They found that higher cortisol was significantly associated with an increased likelihood and increased log odds of timing out. People under stress struggled to finish within the allotted time.
And when the researchers looked at accuracy specifically on those timed-out trials,
that's where they found the real maximum impairment. Accuracy was significantly lower under stress, a 5.69% reduction compared to the control condition, but only on those trials where participants timed out.
What about the trials where they finished in time?
On trials where participants managed to answer before the 40 seconds were up, there was no significant difference in accuracy between the stress and control conditions.
Wow. That is a critical nuance. It means the capacity to decide correctly under stress is maximally impaired only when the stress forces us to rush, or in this case, when we exhaust our time resource just trying to solve the problem.
Stress plus the feeling of running out of time on a hard problem. That's the real killer for decision quality.
So if decision quality drops that sharply when stress and time pressure collide on these hard tasks, we need to know the mechanism. What is the cognitive process that's actually breaking down? The study used gaze tracking to investigate this, right? Looking at changes in attention.
They did. The gaze tracking analysis offered some strong, though they call it tentative, evidence that suggests a profound change in the search strategy that people deploy under stress and experience time pressure.
Especially for those whose cortisol levels really spiked.
Exactly. And what they found was, compared to the control session, in the stress session, participants attended to significantly more items on the screen, but they had a significantly shorter dwell time per visit on each item.
So they're looking at more things, but only glancing at each one briefly. For a complex, high-demand task like the knapsack problem, that sounds like a scattergun approach, not a targeted analysis.
It strongly suggests a shallower and broader search strategy. And this aligns perfectly with known models of how high cortisol impairs cognitive control. Instead of sustaining the deep focus you need for a systematic analysis of a few promising solutions, your attention just scatters across many alternatives. This leads to inefficiency and ultimately a failure to converge on the optimal decision within the time limit.
Now, the knapsack task really has two distinct cognitive challenges, right? There are trials where a solution exists and you have to find it.
The satisfiable
And
trials.
then there are trials where no solution exists and you have to prove that.
The unsatisfiable trials. Did the optimal search strategy differ based on the type of trial?
It did, and this is where the gaze data confirms that stress pushes us toward a potentially suboptimal strategy. The researchers found clear correlations between the search patterns and accuracy based on the task type.
Okay, so for the satisfiable trials, where the goal is to find the specific witness, a combination of items that works, what was the best strategy?
Higher accuracy correlated with attending to fewer items, having longer dwell times per item, and lower overall visit rates.
The hallmark of a targeted, focused, deep search.
Precisely. Conversely, on the unsatisfiable trials, where the goal is proving the absence of a solution by ruling out all the possibilities, higher accuracy was associated with the inverse strategy,
So attending to more items, having shorter dwell times.
and visiting more items per second. This confirmed the benefit of a shallower, broader search strategy when you're trying to negate possibilities.
This is critical. So stress, especially when it's paired with time pressure, seems to default our brains into that scattered, broad search strategy.
The one that is only successful for half of the complex decisions you might face, the ruling things out kind.
While it actively impairs the focused, deep search that's needed for the other half, the finding the solution kind.
So the resulting deficit in decision quality isn't just a function of some overall cognitive decline, it's a mismatch. It's a mismatch between the cognitive strategy your brain deploys under stress and the strategic focus that's actually required by the task itself.
So if your difficult task requires deep, systematic, focus-like debugging complex code or solving a highly constrained optimization problem, acute stress and time pressure will likely force you to adopt the wrong attentional strategy. And that leads directly to that 5.69% drop in accuracy.
This whole discussion of computational hardness and the cost of effort brings us to the final dimension of difficulty we need to cover: effort aversion. The traditional view of human behavior often frames us as cognitive misers.
Right, the idea that we inherently try to avoid cognitive effort. We opt for the path of least resistance.
But our sources suggest this aversion is limited by a really powerful competing factor: boredom.
That's right. Boredom. And it's defined here not just as idleness, but as a state of lacking successful mental engagement. It's found to be similarly aversive to high cognitive demands. People will actively seek out effort, even negative physical experiences, just to avoid being bored.
So the feeling of doing nothing is itself a cognitive cost. How did the research explore this trade-off between avoiding high effort and avoiding boredom?
The researchers used a choice experiment that involved 3 task types, all varying by cognitive demand. There was do nothing, which was the effortless, boring alternative. There was add 1, which was low working memory effort, just simple arithmetic. And there was add 3, which was a modest, harder effort, more complex arithmetic.
And participants just chose between pairs of these tasks over and over.
Exactly. The goal was to test the limits of that cognitive miser hypothesis. Do people always choose the easiest option, regardless of what the alternative is?
And what did the choice data reveal? How does boredom limit our aversion to effort?
They found that our aversion to effort is highly context-dependent. It's relative. The participants' preference for the harder task, the add 3, was significantly greater when the alternative they were presented with was the effortless do-nothing option.
Compared to when the alternative was the less demanding add 1.
Right. So given the choice between add 3, which is hard, and add 1, which is easy, you'd probably pick add 1.
Most people would.
But given the choice between add 3, hard, and do nothing, which is boring, a surprising number of people chose add 3. They willingly sought out the effort just to avoid the mental void of boredom.
Which supports the idea that the cost of cognitive effort isn't some intrinsic fixed value.
No, it's relative, and this ties directly into opportunity cost theories of effort aversion. The cost of the difficult task is determined relative to the value of the alternative activities that are available to you.
And this relative nature was demonstrated so powerfully by manipulating the environmental context itself. They ran the exact same experiment, same tasks, same kind of participants from the same university, but one group did the task in a controlled, sterile lab setting. The other group did it online, at home.
And the finding here is just astonishing. The environmental context had a massive overriding impact on their choices. The participants in the controlled lab setting were a monumental 2.5 times more likely to choose the hard task, the add 3, than the participants who are completing the study online.
Wait, 2.5 times? That means just changing the room, just removing external stimuli and distractions made people dramatically more willing to engage in high cognitive effort.
It completely redefines how we should think about self-control and managing difficulty.
Absolutely. It suggests that complexity management is largely environmental management. In that sterile lab, the alternative activity, the do-nothing option, has a very high internal cost because the environment offers you minimal distraction or meaningful engagement.
The cost of being bored is high, so you choose effort.
Exactly. But in the online setting, at home, the do-nothing alternative is immediately competing with a myriad of potential low-effort distractors. Checking your phone, opening a new tab, talking to someone in the other room. All of those things lower the cost of boredom relative to the high cognitive effort of the Ad3 task.
So the lesson here seems pretty clear. The aversion to effort isn't really a measure of your willpower. It's a calculation that your brain is making based on the opportunity cost of your environment.
So if you want to successfully tackle a hard task, your first strategic move should be to ruthlessly control the context around you. Minimize the alternative activities that make that difficult task seem too costly to undertake.
We've covered three really complex and sometimes contradictory facets of this hard-easy concept. We've talked about the statistical illusion of overconfidence, the necessity of easy pre-training for skill acquisition, and this profound dependence that high performance has on managing your environmental context and stress.
The entire dive really points to one central idea, doesn't it? That true mastery over difficulty requires controlling the conditions around the task, not just forcing your mind to comply.
That's right. And if we synthesize these findings, especially the ones related to context and the limits of our own knowledge, we find some truly counterintuitive truths. Let's start with a scenario where the easy cognitive state, literally knowing less, leads directly to success.
This concept actually came out of research that was initially trying to understand and maybe even eliminate the hard, easy effect in those general knowledge quizzes, specifically the ones about city populations.
That's correct. Researchers tested German students on the populations of American cities and German cities, and they were surprised when they found that the students scored slightly higher on the American cities.
The domain where they ostensibly knew less detailed information?
Exactly. And this pointed to the power of the recognition heuristic, which is a classic example of what they call fast and frugal judgment.
What's the simple rule of this heuristic?
It is the ultimate easy button for your brain. When you're asked to infer which of two objects has a higher value on some criterion, say size or population, if you recognize one of the objects but not the other, you automatically infer that the recognized object has the higher value.
And this relies on the core assumption that the thing you recognize usually does have the higher value in the real world, that the recognition validity is high.
Right. So for the German students, if they recognize, say, Detroit, but had never heard of Milwaukee, they correctly inferred Detroit was larger. Because generally, cities that are important enough to be recognized globally are larger cities. It's a simple, low-effort cognitive state leading to a successful outcome.
It's a perfect example of the less is more effect. When the participants knew too much, for example, when they recognized most of the German cities on the list, they couldn't rely on that simple recognition cue anymore.
They had to fall back on detailed but potentially misleading or conflicting knowledge about city regions, population trends, things like that.
And their reliance on that detailed, difficult knowledge actually caused their accuracy to drop compared to when they could rely on the simple, easy heuristic.
It's a direct connection. An easy cognitive process leads to a successful outcome, but only when the context, the ecological validity of that recognition cue supports it. When the task gets harder, in the sense that you know too much about both items, your performance can actually suffer.
Okay, shifting back to metacognition for a moment, we have to remember that fundamental stability we identified earlier, that stability of individual response styles, the series, and the hysteresis that results from it.
Your internal confidence system resists updating, which explains why the metacognitive hard-easy effect is so persistent, even when objective data, like immediate feedback, is telling you that your internal sense of competence is wrong.
This has a really clear directive for anyone designing education or training. If a student's confidence is highly stable and self-referential, just giving them immediate feedback might not be enough to correct their miscalibration.
It might even introduce noise that causes them to retreat back to their stable set point. It creates a cognitive challenge. We're trying to replace a deeply ingrained, low-effort internal cue, which is their SIRS, with a complex, processing-intensive external cue, which is objective data.
So for confidence to become truly calibrated, the learning system needs to somehow control for or actively mitigate this stability bias.
One implication is that confidence training might need to focus less on just reporting accuracy and more on teaching learners which external cues they should prioritize over their own internal feeling.
Okay, let's try to synthesize all of this into three actionable takeaways for our listener. How can they make difficulty work for them in the real world?
I think we can break it down into the domains we explored: confidence, learning strategy, and high-stakes performance.
Go for it.
Okay, first, for confidence and metacognition, always maintain a healthy skepticism toward high confidence in a difficult domain. The HEE suggests that your certainty might just be a statistical illusion or a simple reflection of your cognitive inertia, your SIRS. It's not a true reflection of objective mastery.
So if the task feels really hard and your confidence is sky high, you should assume you're operating in a state of statistical overconfidence. You need external validation or some kind of structural correction.
Exactly. Second, for learning and acquisition, embrace the easy to hard progression. Do not jump directly to the most challenging tasks, whether that's a physical skill, a complex piece of software, or advanced theoretical knowledge.
The Pavlov lesson.
The Pavlov lesson. Progressive training on easy, contrasting distinctions is necessary to properly develop your selective attention, to filter out the irrelevant cues, and to build those strong associative gradients that unlock your capacity for the subtle, hard distinctions later on. The easy start isn't optional, it's often a prerequisite for mastery.
And finally,
For performance, especially under effort and stress, remember that the cost of mental effort is relative. It's tied closely to the opportunity cost of boredom and distraction. So when you're facing a difficult cognitive task, your first point of attack should be environmental control.
the 2.5 times effect.
That's the one. Ruthlessly ensure your surroundings minimize alternative distractions and boredom. This strategically increases the relative value of the difficult task itself and makes you much more likely to choose effort.
And critically, you have to remember the stress and time pressure interaction. Under acute stress, your performance maximally drops when you run out of time on computationally hard problems.
And the reason is that high cortisol often forces your attention toward that shallow, scattered search strategy. That scattered strategy is only good for ruling things out. If your complex task requires deep, targeted execution, finding the one right solution stress and time pressure are actively working against the very cognitive strategy you need to succeed.
That's the entire picture then. The hard-easy effect is simultaneously a profound warning about cognitive bias, a concrete prescription for optimal training, and a powerful demonstration of how deeply dependent our capacity for complex, high-effort thought is on our external controllable context and our internal physiological state. So we started with this simple-sounding hard-easy effect, that odd moment where we feel too doubtful on easy tasks and way too confident on hard ones. And what we found is that it's actually a sophisticated map of how humans approach and often fail at complexity.
It really is. It reveals this deep miscalibration in our self-assessment, but it also reveals an optimal sequence for mastery and this constant negotiation our brain is making between expending effort and avoiding boredom.
Understanding these effects really allows us to move beyond just talking about simple willpower. We can actively design better learning environments by using that easy-to-hard progression. And crucially, we can mitigate performance loss under stress by recognizing that the pairing of that acute cortisol response and time pressure forces us into these suboptimal search strategies.
It gives you a set of levers to pull that aren't just try harder.
Exactly. So here is a provocative final thought for you to mull over as you approach your next truly complex challenge. Given that the most objective measures of cognitive difficulty computational hardness show that stress impairs our capacity to decide correctly, and the tentative evidence suggests stress makes our attention shallower, we have to ask a question. Is the optimal strategy for managing complexity less about forcing your focus onto the difficult content itself, and far more about strategically controlling the context, the stress, the time, and the alternatives that are surrounding the decision? It suggests that if you want to solve hard problems, you must first master the art of controlling your environment.